I ended up leaving early, and that most people would look at me like that is insanity. You were that close to like a retirement pension. Why would you do that? And so circling back, again, with you being an officer, operating in LEAC, seeing what the complaints are for the officers, seeing what the complaints are for the community, why is it that officers are leaving?
You know, here's another elephant in the room, and this holds true, and this is about organizations. By and large, people don't leave organizations. They leave leaders. They leave managers. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard of somebody said, I'm done with this police job because of that person I'm working for.
Chris Burns, you are the first person that's a repeat guest on the program, so thank you so much for coming back.
Appreciate you having me.
And since your episode when you were on last time, there's been quite a bit of a development. So now
you could say that.
We talked last time, and I have a little bit of an introduction that I'm going to read for you in case any of our viewers, by the way, viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us again. You know, we talked about your Army career. We talked about your extensive career on the police department, up to and including some of the stuff you did with SWAT, as well as being a negotiator. That's where one of the things that we did together. But now you dropped the bomb on me, and you told me that at this point in time, you've decided to take a step further. You want to better the city of Colorado Springs by becoming a city council member.
Correct.
Okay. And so before I give your introduction, I'm just curious, what is it that drives a person to want to go that route? I mean, I think of politics.
I have completely lost my mind.
Is that your response or what your wife would tell you?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, I think anyone that looks at a system and says, I don't like the way it's going, you have a choice. You can, in some way, sit on the sideline and complain, or you could say, I'm going to step up and I will take a position of leadership to do whatever I can do to fix this. And that's the choice I had to start making. I had been on a city council subcommittee for law enforcement advisory, and I would make suggestions, and this committee would make suggestions and stuff, and tried to be in communication with the police department about, hey, what can we do to make things better, and didn't feel like I was moving the needle.
Okay.
And when and the city of Colorado Springs has districts, which I didn't quite know. I had to learn all this. I'm in the 5th district. There are 6 geographical districts of the city of Colorado Springs for the city council. There's 1 elected city council person from each district, and 3 people that are at large, which means they cover the whole city.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the election cycle runs basically leap steps over it. So you elect the 6 council people, and then the 3 at-larges are a 2-year different offset in the elections. As it turns out, these 6 council people that are up for election now, 2 of them are what are called incumbents. They've run a 4-year term on the city council, and you can run 2 terms. So they're competing for the next term that they'll have. It turns out that the person who's in my district is what they call an incumbent. She's been there for 4 years. She's done a term, and now she's running a campaign to get the second term. When I looked at my district and some of the decisions she was making, nice person, I've met her, but I was not in agreement with a lot of the decisions, what I perceived to be very liberal, lighter on crime. Basically, I said, I believe I can do a better job. And that's the approach I took. So in the race that I'm in, and I have not done anything political before, so God bless America that we have a system that lets somebody that's had a career in something now step away and then say, I want to go into city leadership, or I want to go into a leadership role in the government.
Sure.
So I think you do get, in that case, you get a lot of people that have the potential for a very varied and professional background in other areas that can create a better leader and a better counsel.
Well, it's so funny. I did some thinking the other day, and what I was thinking about were career politicians.
Yep.
And so many people look at them as, that's what you have to be if you want to, if you want to climb the ladder and you want to be a politician and you want to do great things.
Right.
What I think is interesting is if you go back far enough, when our country was set up and when we started doing things like this, the concept of career politician that didn't exist. It was people like you.
Yep.
That you had a career, you got something to change, and you say, you know what, I'm going to get up there and I'm going to do something. I'm going to speak up for my community. And so I think that's the way it should be. Those career politicians, in my opinion, they're kind of
and there is no shortage of examples of people at the government, Congress, and Senate levels that they come in, and those positions pay something like $170,000 a year, give or take.
Yeah,
they'll come in first term and they stay for X number of years, and then all of a sudden they're worth $50 million, and you go, how did that happen?
Yeah,
that math does not add up. So I'm looking at that and I'm going, that just unsettles me. I'm completely 100% in favor of term limits at the federal level.
Absolutely.
I'm like, I don't want a career politician. In the city council race that I'm in, I will say, I'm absolutely doing it for the paycheck, because the city council in Colorado Springs is paid like $6,000 a year.
No kidding.
I mean, it's literally pays your parking. It is a volunteer position for anybody that does it,
Sure.
Hands down. And although it has 2 work sessions and 2 full-day meetings a month, the council people I've talked to, it is a full-time job. Mm-hmm. You will research, you will meet with other city departments, you will plan, you will have all kinds of secondary meetings. And to do it well, you have to have a full-time schedule available,
Sure.
No question. And so here I am, as you said before from our past podcast, I had retired from the military, had a concurrent career, and then I retired from the police department.
Yeah.
So that has provided me a level of finance that I said, well, I don't have to work if I don't have to, but I'm not about to take out my fishing pole and go sit at the lake.
Yeah.
It also doesn't give me enough to go buy super sports cars and travel the world. No, it's a very menial. I don't do flashy stuff. I don't buy crazy stuff. So here I am in retirement going, I don't have to work. But I said, I still have a really strong desire to make the system better.
Well, and it's funny with police officers or former police officers. Yeah. I mean, the minute they retire, I heard a study somewhere. I don't remember exactly where it came from, but something about a police officer that works 25, 30 years, they retire. If they don't do anything to try and keep their mind busy, they statistically will die within 5 years.
Oh, it's a really bad statistic, and that's true. One of the things I experienced, and I'll give this as a kind of a cautionary tone for officers that are retiring, is when I retired, I had retired from patrol, which is, as you're well familiar, you start patrol at whatever your hour is, and it's literally a go. It's a race. There are priority 1 calls holding for you when you show up, and your day does not end.
Yeah.
At 10 hours when you're supposed to end, if you're not on a call, okay, you're lucky. You're probably 11 or 12 hours into it before you can close out and get back, and that's running literally call to call to call. And I'd been doing that for years. And so when I retired, it was almost like the treadmill that I was running hard on stopped.
Sure.
And here I am in this space of I got to keep working, And so the couple volunteer agencies, I did some tutoring for some kids. It was like I had to keep this 10, 12-hour a day pace going. And it was really difficult because all of a sudden now there's no structure. I don't have to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it kind of sent me into a little bit of a tailspin, just kind of in headspace wise. And so I really empathize with those officers that struggle in retirement. And when I looked at things like how do I make the system better, I applied to the Law Enforcement Transparency Committee or Advisory Transparency Committee called LEAC. And that gave me some purpose to say, okay, I'm not on the street anymore, but I'm really wanting to try to give back. The other thing is, bless their hearts, everybody on that LEAC committee has agreed to say we want to change things with the political process, but there are clearly some attitudes across the spectrum, to include some that I believe are not in favor of a lot of the stuff with the police. And so in a sense, I felt like I was kind of keeping my finger in the dike from sometimes this wave of anti-police sentiment. And I said, no, we need to focus on it here and speak back against it.
Sure.
And I really worked hard on that.
Well, let's, I tell you what, so let me read your background real quick, and that includes a little bit on LEAC. Okay. So Chris Burns is a lifelong resident of the area with an incredible 30 years of service to his community, from his 24-year tenure as a Colorado Springs Police Department officer to his service as a military officer in the National Guard. I have officer in here. You were enlisted, though, right?
No. I started enlisted. I actually enlisted.
Okay.
Got college pay, commissioned, which means I became an officer.
Sure.
I retired as a lieutenant colonel.
Okay.
From the National Guard.
My apologies. Nope. I put that in there. I started second-guessing myself.
No, as some would say, I didn't work for a living, if you have been military and get that joke.
Well, so, I got to tell you, I mean, if you started enlisted and commissioned, then you would be considered a Mustang, and those are some of the hardest working people, right? All right. Since retiring in 2022, Chris has dedicated himself to preparing for a future role in city leadership, gaining invaluable business and governance experience along the way. He's been deeply involved in local nonprofits and served on the Law Enforcement Transparency and Advisory Committee, all while staying connected to the heart of what makes Colorado Springs such a special place to live. As a city council candidate for District 5, Chris is driven by a clear and practical vision for his community, advocating for a balanced growth, stronger public safety, and expanded housing options. His focus on sustainable development, innovative solutions to homelessness, and a commitment to enhancing police services reflect his years of hands-on experience and a deep understanding of the district's needs.
Wow, that sounds pretty very flattering. I can't say I deserve it, but it that's kind of the road I've been on. I did not, when I first joined the city council subcommittee, have this idea I was going to want to be a city council person. That's only been recently. Yeah. In fact, it's only been like in the last 3 months that I talked to some city council people, talked about the races coming up, and someone said, "Why don't you run?" Sure. And I was like, "Oh, I'm not a politician. I don't know a thing about all the stuff you do." And they're like, "Oh no, you have the background that would make this a good fit." So I did some soul searching, talked to some people, and I got a lot of positive feedback. And I said, well, kind of in the vein of you kind of gravitate toward where either you're needed or that you feel you'll have a purpose. I said, I've been sitting on the sidelines regarding complaining about politics and city issues, and jump in the ring, jump in the pool. And I jumped right in the deep end.
Well, so that being said, I mean, let's start it off strong. Yeah. You want to be a city council member for District 5. Yep. What are the biggest issues that you feel you can change for the better of Colorado Springs?
So I would say first thing is public safety. I'm really concerned about where and the challenges our police department have. When I came on, we had a culture and a response and a relationship in the community that I remember really well. I went through the Ferguson, the George Floyd, the depolicing movement, the anti-cop sentiment, and I just saw how devastating it was, both in practical terms to how the community related to us, as well as the morale on the police officers. And then I saw the deterioration of the police services and response just based on officer attrition, and ones that we lost officers, we weren't maintaining our recruiting and output, basically throughput. If you picture the boat, we're pushing people in while we have holes in the boat with things seeping out, and we really needed to fix that. Sure. And still do. Now I am confident that on the national level I'm feeling that tide beginning to turn. Here in Colorado Springs, though, with my background in the police department, I say, so first thing I'm a big proponent of is an increase in officer pay, particularly the line level officer. Okay. From that perspective, we have a real challenge in that new officers coming in are not staying, quote, sticking as long as they had in the past. They weren't looking in the past. When I came in, I said, I'm going to be a cop for an entire career. Now it seems as if there's a generational gap that says, I'm going to come in and try this cop thing for a couple years. If it doesn't work out, I'll leave. What do you mean I don't get weekends and nights free, that kind of stuff? So as you and I both know, when we came on, man, if you had given me third shift, midnight, out guarding the airport parking lot, I've been happy as a you-know-what and stuff. So, but it seems like there's just a generational shift that I think we need to address, and it's a challenge. And I don't minimize the challenge that the police department itself faces in dealing that. On the other end, we're losing mid-career and longer career officers. I think some of them have just seen enough and been through the hard times that they said, rather than doing a 30-year career, I'm good at stopping at, say, 20 or, a little less than that.
And I hear you when you say the pay, and I think that we can all agree. Pay in policing is, there's a lot of positions now that are desk jobs out there that you can get paid the same or more. So getting paid for a position where you're not really making much pay, people hate you, they spit on you, they attack you, they try to kill you, and then the community...
Those are the small number of incidents, but they leave a big impression. Now, I will say the majority of the community does support their police, but the challenge is you're dealing in, a lot of times, that side that doesn't.
Well, and but let's be honest here. A small number of contacts, yes, but at the same time, I opened the news today and we had an officer-involved shooting. I believe it was today or yesterday. We had one just a couple days ago. Now, I don't know the specifics on it, but that does tell me they're using lethal force. And per our policy and procedure from when I was on the department, that means they were a significant threat to the community. So I guess here's my ultimate question. Will pay fix it, right? Because if we're losing officers...
It is a part. I won't say it will, quote, fix, but here's the perspective I would give you. And you were probably the same way. When I was looking at becoming a police officer, I applied to the Colorado Springs Police Department. I also applied to a couple of other agencies around Colorado. So in that idea, part of that decision for me was to look at how much will I make here, how much will I make at other places, and will the process here get me through and allow me to be a police officer? Well, right now, because of the demand for police officers, people that are looking at being police officers can literally look at the different departments, and their decision is influenced by how much they'll make at each one. Now, some would say, oh, such and such a department is within, say, $2,000 in a year or $3,000, and that really isn't enough to justify, except I look at that and I say, you're talking about that much money over 10 years or 20 years, and then it starts to look a little bigger. The other part about it is, and we can get into some of this, is we talk about our housing costs. When I became a police officer in 98, I was able to buy my first house. I bought a 2-car garage, 4-bedroom, 2-bath kind of house, nice suburban. You can't do that now with the level of pay versus what our cost of living is. So you're asking officers to come work in our city, and oh, by the way, you're going to have to live either in a rental situation, or as we kind of discussed, you have to, in Colorado Springs, we're mostly a north-south town, but you have to drive east into farmland until you can afford a house. So there's a commute dynamic to that also. Now, so it's by no means is it a complete solve at all. But the other part about it is, as a city council person, it is one of the buttons I'll have a vote on, where I will be in favor of stronger pay for officers. And I'm also in favor of putting that pay in such a structure that those, as you would say, line-level patrol people or detectives, in our department, you start at a P5 or P4, I can't remember which.
P4. And
then you climb that to P3, P2, P1, and that would happen at about 4 years. And we used to say P1 plus 1, meaning you're a first grade officer plus 1 year, makes you qualified for everything. You can go to detectives and SWAT and things, but they wanted you to have those 3 or 4 years on the street to get seasoned and trained. Because of our manpower issues now, we're not seeing that anymore. So we're getting officers of a lower experience level into a lot of specialized units, which has some challenges because you're asking people to, say, work in a homicide unit, which takes a substantial amount of experience, and bringing in almost a brand new officer in some cases.
Sure.
But back to that pay level, I'm also in favor of, at P1, you make basically the top out on the pay chart minus cost of living adjustments, but I would like to see a pay bump at, say, P plus 10. At 10 years, you get another bump in pay, effectively a longevity recognition. At 15 years, another jump in pay. For that officer to then begin to start to look at it and say, well, number one, I get a boost in pay at 10 years and a boost in pay at 15 years, and so I'm also incentivized to stay at that patrol level to bring the experience level of a long-term serving officer to the patrol level, to the detective bureau, to that. A lot of officers say, well, I'm going to start as a patrolman, but then I'm just going to start testing for supervisor and sergeant, and that's great. More power to you, except just because you were a good officer, a good patrol person, doesn't translate into you now have the skills to supervise. And industries all over the world have understand this. You know, you go from being a specialist to being a supervisor of people, and that's a leadership and training step up. As you experienced in the military, every rank you go up, whether you're enlisted or officer, there's a school, there's a curriculum, there's a reading list, there's a recognized dynamic that says you have to train your leaders.
Sure.
So back to that, what else would I do with the department? And I think that, you know, we're very challenged with morale. And I will first say that being a police supervisor is probably, next to being a combat leader in a combat zone, probably one of the hardest leadership roles that you could imagine. And I have huge deference and respect for people that want to take that on. And what I'm saying is that, hey, I would like to see something to the effect of, say, a scholarship leadership program that would be in the department over a long period of time that officers could participate in and be scholarshiped into, where it would say, for example, 1 hour a week, a couple hours a month, maybe a seminar every month on specific things like leadership, mentorship, coaching, organizational structures, things like that, so your academic side of your leadership equation continues, as well as your practical leadership with your officers. The real genesis for that idea came about as I look back on all the supervisors in the department I had and realized that some of the best supervisors I had were prior military people that had leadership experience, had that counseling experience. So I would sit down, you know, I've had supervisors where I sit down as a patrol officer and they say, here's all your performance objectives. They slide the card across the table and they say, we just need your signature. Okay, now we're done. Get out there. That was it.
Sure.
We all felt that. As opposed to others that would sit down and say, okay, what do you want to do in the department? How do we partner and help you become a better officer? What do you think you need training on? And then they would follow through and they would arrange training in those given areas. And again, I won't at all minimize the absolute challenges of scheduling where you are literally trying to build the train as it's running down the track. Right. The level of service and demand for work is huge.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I would agree with you. First of all, just getting to your point right there, leadership.
Yeah.
So much so that I've actually brought that up with the command staff before. And the response that I was given was, we're not going to do anything extra because we don't have the officers to run calls for service. And yada, yada, yada. So it fell to the individual officer to identify that they are deficient in leadership and, you know, take steps, read books, go to Jocko has a great leadership course that people can attend or see online. And yet when I talk to a lot of these people that fill these leadership positions, they don't. They're actually, I've been told by a few of the sergeants that they are so overworked that they have to take reports home to review them when they're not at work. And so I guess I see where we're going, but I kind of feel like
I won't minimize the challenge on that. Now,
sure.
to give an analogy, I've did a number of active duty tours throughout my police career. During one of my active duty tours, I was working at U.S. Northcom, and that's as you can imagine, it's a 12-hour day shift, and you're constantly administratively going. It's a real demanding position. But during that time, I also said, well, I believe for my professional development and for my, quote, promotability, I should probably pick up a master's degree. So I went to night school over the 2.5, 3 years I was there and picked up a master's degree. Just based on the fact that I said, hey, for my own personal development, this is something that, one, I want to learn the body of knowledge, but also I want to show that I have learned that body of knowledge, both for my own benefit as well as potential promotions. And it did. It probably was a large factor as to why I got promoted on the military side.
Sure.
In the police side, we're bringing in a lot of officers that might have 60 hours of college credit. okay, I get that. That, college, one way or the other, once you become a police officer, that training you get as a police officer, that experience, your academic background behind that police experience is only increased. It's not to say that a person that doesn't have 4 years of college or more is not a good police officer, but it's to say that you begin to build your capabilities. You begin to add to the tools in your toolbox. Mm-hmm. And so I would look at it really from a standpoint that said, if you have an officer that's working 40, 50 hours a week, and they say, and I want to participate in this program where I can pick up academic credits, potentially as a scholarship, and I'd be looking at grants and things like that to do that, that would distinguish that officer in terms of if an officer says, hey, I do want to prepare for a leadership role in supervisory areas of the department. And likewise, I would also look at that for the higher levels of supervision, saying each level brings its own new education, its own dynamic. Okay. There are a lot of police commanders, police lieutenants who prioritize and say, for instance, get a master's in public administration. I would like to see something happen in forms of being able to scholarship that to officers or supervisors.
So let me ask you this. I mean, what's the pushback that you anticipate? Because I have my own feelings on it, but I'm curious if you were to present this right now, I think the community would agree, right? Like, first of all, we have to have leadership. We have to have officers that are able to be these strong leaders, which we don't have right now. Yep. And that's not necessarily through the fault of the officer. But here we are. From my understanding of how this works, city council gets a vote. Everything's still going to go through the mayor, essentially. So what is the pushback that you think the command staff or leadership?
We've always done it this way. We're fine. We've always done it this way, and there are things. Whether or not you agree with everything that happened through all the anti-police movement, part of it is a re-evaluation of how police services are delivered.
Sure,
is this what the community wants? Well, one of the things that I look at, and I'm not speaking just about the Colorado Springs Police Department, which I think may actually do probably better than some. There are leadership seminars that happen a couple times a year, which is great. I fully support that. But I'm saying there needs to be an opportunity for more. Police departments all across the country pretty much will tell you, if you want to be a supervisor in a police department, okay, you take a test, you do some process, and lo and behold, they pin stripes on you. And then they go, okay, and here's all your supervisory duties, go to it. And that's it. And then it's sink or swim. Some have some mentorship programs, some effectively what they call police training officer programs for supervisory levels. But after that, you're just running and gunning, and you're just doing that job. Whereas to say, okay, you've now achieved, or you've expressed a desire to promote, let's get you some training, let's get a syllabus, let's have you complete, whether they be online, whether they be hybrid courses, whether there be for instance, you can go to the Department of Defense, and you can look at different reading lists that different senior generals have put out, 8 or 10 books.
Interesting.
That they all recommend you need to read as a aspiring leader.
Yeah.
Because again, leadership just doesn't arrive at you and you know how to do things. Leadership is a process of experience, and it's also a process of very much study and education.
When you present this, I'm curious, is there going to be any sort, it's fine if you don't have any thoughts on this yet, any thoughts on how you're going to implement this to the upper echelon of police services as well? Because I kind of feel like, from my experience, even if this is mandated, they will brush it off and say, well,
and here's, one, I would hope I would be able to build a collaborative relationship with senior members of the police department.
Well, don't you have that already? Because you're with LEAC, right? Isn't that?
I would say my experience has not been that. I've been on LEAC, and my experience has been that I may not have gained favor with anyone from my participation in that committee with the department.
Interesting.
I don't. It has been an interesting experience. You would think.
I bet. Yeah.
Now there have been things that I've been very supportive with the department, but there are other things I've been critical of. I have found that giving feedback that's counter to what a senior staff person on the department might perceive kind of puts you in a light of, we're going to close the blue doors on this one, and we're not going to deal with you anymore. Yeah. But again, part of it is saying, from the city council position, and there is a bit of a limitation on what can a single city council person do. Well, we vote on budgets, and we set city policy. So with that, that's a little bit bigger stick, but still not a very big one. You have to build coalition. You have to build relationships, as I'm learning, which is important. But again, committed to looking at things like better officer pay, better officer training. I'm looking at trying to move the ship just a few degrees in the right direction. And my goal would be to then, again, improve the working environment for those officers.
Well, so with that being said, as far as the working environment, I'd really like to just call out the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Through your experience as a cop, city council, LEAC, and what you're looking at in the future, why is it that officers are leaving? And I'm not talking about nationwide, right? Because if I understood before we started recording, you said we have 700 and how many officers?
As of January 1st, we're at 734 officers.
Okay.
And since then, they've graduated a class of 23.
But if I recall correctly, so I've been out since 2023.
Yeah.
The mayor approved 800 officers.
839.
839
is the approved number, of which we're probably, with that class came out, I don't know how much attrition we've had. We may be sitting at about 750.
That's fine, but when I left, we were at 770. So no matter what, we're still losing the officers.
So I have to go back and look at the data on what level of officers we had at a given date. Okay. Here's a challenge. I've been a little bit. Sometimes we get a number, if you're not clear about what you're asking for, they'll include all the people in the academy pipeline. And I go,
why do they do that?
I recognize, one, the need to show we have a large number of officers. The other thing is, by the time in the hiring process you funnel down to get the officers that actually get boots on the ground in the academy, that's a huge step. Now, all of them won't necessarily make it through, and all of them won't necessarily make it through the police training PTO period, which is on the street with a training officer. But again, the recognition that those people are there and are potential full licensed police officers, fully charged police officers is there. So I won't say why do they do that. The cynical side of myself says, oh, they just want to show that we got more officers than we do. Well,
that was my takeaway too.
Well, okay, anyway. So my experience, and I'll draw on my military experience, is as a prior military company commander, if my battalion commander ever said to me, how many officers do you have on the ground right now? Anything other than the number down to the man. I have 150 officers in the field right now. I have 20 officers on leave. I have 10 officers in sick call. I have 2 in school. I have going down to justify every single name on your roster. If you got a wrong answer, you were asking to lose your job.
Sure.
From the military side. So that was huge. Now, again, in any given day, you have people coming out of an academy. You also have retirements, resignations, things like that. So that number is going to fluctuate, but you want the fluctuation to continue to rise up to your authorized. And I will say, I would advocate for again, that 839 number that the Springs Police is authorized to be. I think that's still too small. I think I think we need to have higher numbers. So
what does Denver have? They're authorized like 1,500 or something.
They're about somewhere around that number, 1,500. Now, Denver is a municipal department that's landlocked by a bunch of other cities, and they have about 650,000 people, versus Colorado Springs, 500,000. But yeah, you're looking at upwards past 1,200 officers, and they're struggling for officers also. Most departments around that are. But again, part of that is saying people will pick departments based on a number of factors: livability of the city, pay of the officers. Hey, what's the leadership culture like? Those are all things that people really take into account when they decide to become police officers.
So officers that are in the middle of their career, the end of their career, when you and I were on the department, we've had officers that have made it past 40 years.
Yeah.
And that was, they made it up to command staff level. They were dedicated that they were going to stay. But now you do have the middle of the road officers, and me being one of them. I had 12 years, almost 13 on, and I ended up leaving early, and that most people would look at me like that is insanity. You were that close to like a retirement pension. Why would you do that? And so, circling back again with you being an officer, operating in LEAC, seeing what the complaints are for the officers, seeing what the complaints are for the community. Why is it that officers are leaving?
You know, here's another elephant in the room, and this holds true, and this is about organizations. By and large, people don't leave organizations. They leave leaders. They leave managers. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard of somebody said, I'm done with this police job because of that person I'm working for.
Sure.
And I'm not referring to the chief, but I'm saying like the most critical one is their immediate supervisor. And the human resource roles are full of line level supervisors that people just won't work for. They're just that challenge to work with, unreasonable.
Yeah.
I've had supervisors that I held a high level of esteem for, and I've had supervisors that I just gritted my teeth every time I had to interact with them. And again, I will first off hold myself out and say I'm just not the perfect person. Nobody's a perfect cop. Nobody's a perfect anything. Sure. But you have to have that leadership that you think has your back, that you can trust. Even if you're in the wrong, that leader says, we're going to be fair. We're going to stick with you. We're going to work through it. One of my in Colorado Springs, we have the Colorado Springs Police Department. In El Paso County, in the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. Anecdotally, I will say that my understanding is that there's a much lower attrition from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and I was kind of surprised by that. I don't have any background in that environment to know firsthand, but what I do see is Sheriff Joe Roybal going up to the state and advocating for better laws, stronger laws, protecting law enforcement officers, for advocating for strong laws of law enforcement here in El Paso County, and people resonate with that. Yeah. Absolutely. So there are different dynamics, but again, it comes back to some basic leadership. Do you believe that your leadership cares about you? Mm-hmm. And I think that's true in any organization.
Well, it's funny because I still, every single day, I have officers reach out to me, even officers I've never met. Yeah. And I hear the same thing over and over, and that's just they feel there's a disparity between how command staff is held accountable versus how the line level officer is held accountable. So when you say, you trust that the leaders are firm but fair, I think that's completely reasonable. That's what I would expect from like when I was in the Marine Corps, when you were in the Army. Yep. If you mess up, you need to be held accountable. Right. But there's a way to do it to make sure that you still have a functioning soldier, Marine, or in this case, a police officer. You get them retrained. Now, if they broke the law, that's different, and they need to be held accountable that way.
Fully supportive of, absolutely. If you abuse your power, you need to be held account to the fullest extent of the law. The difference I would say that I experienced from military to police is, in the military, if a soldier made a mistake, did something counter to training, it literally was that soldier came head hung low and said, "Sir, I messed up. I XYZ happened. I didn't make the right call. I'm so sorry. I'll own whatever I have." And there really was this element that they let the team down. And so and you talk about officers that have reached out to you. Since I've been in now this cycle for maybe going into city government, they have been reaching out to me also. Sure. And there is a feeling that they are not held and processed fairly. And that was held true in what was called the PERF report. That was an outside agency that came in, Police Education Research Foundation. And one of the things they said is that officers, through polls with officers, they said the procedural justice internal to the department is not perceived as being fair between staff or supervisory level officers and line level officers. Sure. And that was a perception held by the unit, by the department. So that's a challenge.
Well, and I think that's a huge perception with just any of the line level guys. You talk to them and they say, how can the command staff members do it, but me as a regular officer, I get held accountable, and that's how it should be, but then the command staff members get away with it.
And there is a challenge that I will say, in that a lot of times with discipline in any organization, the police department included, what actually happens to that person in a disciplinary proceedings is not released. So sometimes you can come away with the perception that an event happened to a senior level officer, and you don't know what happened. So you assume nothing happened when, in fact, maybe there was some significant corrective action, disciplinary, but just wasn't released. Not unlike the community feels when they see a bad event with an officer on the street, and the police department says, "Yep, we've investigated. We've worked with that officer," quote, but they don't necessarily release what happened. Now that has changed also in that officers, when they have been found to be in policy violation within the community, they are releasing the disciplinary reports, which is its own challenge too. But I understand the perspective and the challenges around how do you, with transparency, show that people have been held account for violations of policy, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that something needs to be done if someone, I mean, how do you hold, let's say you have lieutenant, commander, deputy chief.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the only person that can hold them really accountable would be the mayor. And I mean, am I right on that?
You are correct. So there is an organizational leadership challenge that says the higher you get up to that pyramid, up until the chief of police, and the chief of police works only for the mayor. Mm-hmm. It's that relationship. And really the mayor has only really one button: keep or get rid of the chief, that kind of thing. And even, I would say, from a leadership perspective, you don't want the mayor reaching down into the police ranks to make decisions. Mm-hmm. That's a real organizational challenge. But again, there has to be that level of confidence that there will be that procedural justice, as the Springs Police Department has stated itself.
Sure.
So it is a challenge. It is a challenge.
Well, I got to tell you, Chris, I'm just happy. I see you want to do something more. You want to look out for these officers. And all I can say is, the struggles that are going on better than most people. And it makes me feel good that you are looking into them to the extent of your ability, but you're trying to course correct the ship. Because I got to be honest, and I think any of our viewers and listeners would agree, since 2020, a lot of cities have made some really poor decisions. And I don't view Colorado Springs as necessarily really screwing up, like some of these city councils have abolished their police.
And there are anti-police adversarial district attorneys that are, I believe, in some instances, for political motivations, prosecuting police officers.
Sure.
For use of force incidents, things like
that. I've heard of a few up in Denver, actually. Yep.
And that is a really challenging dynamic. One, you do want to hold police officers accountable, but at the same time, recognize that just as a community, we ask another human being to say, okay, we're going to give you X amount of weeks of training, and then you're going to be an individual that, by your duties that you're sworn to, you're going to be put into some of the most difficult, emotionally, physically challenging confrontations and issues you could ever put a human into. Mm-hmm. One of the things I say is that you can absolutely demand excellence of your police department, but you can't demand perfection. Right. These are humans, and sometimes they're going to get it wrong. And I will say, as I look back at my own career, the way I did policing when I was a 2-year officer on was literally night and day from when I was a 20-year officer on.
Sure.
And I can tell you that there were citizens that were not happy with my interactions at 2 years, that as a 20-year officer, I look back and I just shake my head and I'm like, oh, geez, that was not well. That was not good.
Yeah.
It's almost like by the time I was at 20 years and on, you kind of get this flow. They talk about it in athletics or when you're in your space. I was having a great time interacting in difficult conversations with citizens, and I did the job much better than I did than when I was an officer. And the benefit to the city to have that 20-year officer being the officer that shows up in the cruiser to work with your problem is a huge benefit to the community.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Can we talk about LEAC a little bit?
Sure.
Just because I'm kind of curious about that. So again, just for our viewers and listeners, Law Enforcement Transparency Advisory Committee.
Yeah.
So this is a committee,
right?
And am I understanding that they are the go-between where people have a complaint against the police? Explain that to me.
So I wasn't on LEAC when it first formed. LEAC was formed post George Floyd. There was a lot of community distress, lack of trust, frustration, and the city council made the decision that said, we will make a subcommittee. Now, I'll put a pitch out for anybody that lives in a city. Go visit your city council and realize there are a lot of these subcommittees that look at everything from roads to utilities to planning. And there are always volunteers openings to where you can go in and get involved in your political process as a volunteer. An hour a month or something, one meeting a month or 2 meetings a month, to really personally have input to your city. But this LEAC, the Law Enforcement Advisory Committee, was designed to provide recommendations to city council that could then be transferred and given to the department.
Okay.
A lot of what we do is looking at, say, the police budget, and some of it's a matter of just asking questions. Why do you spend X amount of dollars on this subject, this line item? And they'll go in and they'll talk about what they do. We went ahead and we worked with, and I mentioned earlier, what was called the PERF Committee, Police Education Research Foundation. That was an outside agency at the police department's request that came in and evaluated the department on all things from morale to equipment to staffing. And we looked at their findings and we looked at their recommendations, and then we said, yep, we agree with this. We should prioritize something. So, one of the things that the committee does, we'll tell city council, we advocate for, say, a bigger budget for this. We advocate that maybe a program such as this would happen. For me, two of the and I should say, although we make these recommendations to city council, the department doesn't have to abide by them or tell us why they didn't abide by them. So there's a little bit of a challenge in that we don't necessarily get feedback back to our committee. But what I do find is that the community can come in and say, hey, we've had a problem. And it's not about, say, investigating an officer. It's not about a specific complaint. But many citizens do have frustrations with the department. They don't feel their grievance was heard, and we're in that same area. They want to come talk to us. We have open meetings. We really have to tell them we don't investigate officers. We're not in that role. As they're telling whatever their frustration is, maybe there's a point of policy that we said, wait, is that an accurate perception? Was that done? Maybe there's a policy issue here that we can look at. One person came in and complained that they were given feedback saying that if you waited a certain amount of time, you couldn't make a complaint because it was past a certain date, and we were able to resolve and say, oh, no, that wasn't actually the case. So there are some minor things that we could look at. Okay. But we don't say, oh, yeah, that shouldn't have gone down that way. We're going to go do an investigation. We're not an oversight committee, and I'm not in favor of those.
Okay.
All right. So back to the committee itself. Individuals, again, are nominated for, and then the city council picks who's on that committee based on the geographical area along with the city council districts, as well as some open positions or at-large positions that would cover the whole area. So there's usually anywhere from like I've seen 6 to 9 to 12 people on that committee. Okay. And then again, every person that's in there sitting at that table wants to make the system better. That I give them that kudos. Not everybody approaches the committee from a positive perspective or positive experiences with the police department. And I will tell you,
that's probably a good thing, actually, to have them on.
I agree.
Yeah.
And really, one of my roles that I see on that committee is to say, hey, I'm the one with police experience that you're all discussing about, and frequently I'm able to say, no, here is why the police do course of action A. Here's why they do that kind of thing. So I can kind of inject some kind of real world into it.
So when it comes to LEAC, let's say you're on it, you have something that you've come up with that you want to make a recommendation to the police department. How often do they take it and run with it and do something? I mean, I know that you don't get the feedback, but has there been anything significant?
Yeah, back to that, I don't get the feedback. So a lot of times we take it under advisory.
Okay.
Now, as an example, one of the things that I recommended was I said, hey, I think every line level police officer should have 1 hour of hands-on arrest control training per pay period, which is 2 weeks, 40 hours.
It's a great idea.
And so you think about it, you come in from your shift, you got 3 or 4 of you, and you say, hey, we're able to use this hour of time. Let's go in the mat room. Let's review handcuffing. Let's review arrest control techniques and how to be safe around people that are physically potentially aggressive. Because, again, one of the things that I saw as a police training officer, particularly, and I'll kind of make a generalization, new generation comes into the police, becomes a police officer, but they haven't had necessarily a lot of the neighborhood raising that I think many people used to have, which was you scrap around with your friends, you're in push matches, shove matches. So it's not the first time you've seen it. I've interacted with people who have been in the academy and on the street who says, I've never been in a street fight. I've never had to do this. This is really an uncomfortable area for me.
Yeah.
One of the things I will say, particularly if law enforcement officers are listening to this, is if you are not doing hands-on training on a regular basis, you're fooling yourself and you're a liability. And I don't care how big you are. There's a lot of officers that are particularly new ones that have what I call the badge confidence. They put the uniform on and the badge, and now they are puffed up and thinking that they've gained some super skill, and they haven't. And the other dynamic to that is officers that regularly train, whether it's, I don't even care what the style is, jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, boxing, martial arts, any of that. When they're proficient, when they've reached a level of confidence, they have less use of force incidents. Other officers that are not as confident, they get into a situation, it's a very anxiety-producing, it's very fearful, and so a scared officer reverts to a taser or a gun. I'm not saying they use lethal force immediately, but I'm saying they present it. And I don't agree with that. It's not necessarily the best way to do it. Or the other part about it is they're not trained to a sufficient level, and so they may have gotten the right techniques, but they get into a push-shove match, and their adrenaline goes through the roof, and their anxiety's high, and they forget everything, and they go lizard brain.
Sure.
And they just respond where the training just wasn't there. And that's a human reaction. But it's a training issue that you have to be able to train through. And by training enough and regularly, that can mitigate that negative outcome.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So we had talked a little bit, and I think we just lightly touched on it before we move on. You brought up earlier, and I think this goes back into the hiring versus attrition. What is the response time of CSPD right now?
The Gazette, our newspaper here in Colorado Springs, came out with the latest number, and it was 23 minutes for a 911 call response.
So priority one?
Yeah, priority one. So that is not all the time, but that's that span where that's the median. So you're going to get quicker responses, and you may get longer responses. Again, a message to the citizen, when that citizen picks up the phone and calls 911, they're in a absolutely crisis situation. It could be a violent event, it could be a medical event, it could be something like that, but they're in it for a long time.
Absolutely. So obviously the more officers that we get, the response time should go down, hopefully, and if we can stop attrition to some degree, that would also benefit us.
It is probably almost a function of that number of officers on a patrol, on the patrol bureau. Mm-hmm. By increasing that number, yes, you will reduce your response time.
Okay. Let's go ahead and let's transition a little bit. Yeah. One of the things that you are running on talks about your stance on homelessness.
Okay.
And some of the things that you want to do, I guess, to work with the homeless or prevent homelessness. What are your thoughts on that? How do you relate to that particular topic?
It is a complex problem, and here's some of the dynamics that you're faced with. Let's suppose you had a dream budget. You could do anything you want, and you said, I'm just going to build more facilities, more shelters, more food kitchens, that kind of thing. In a sense, your efforts to do that can actually incentivize and enable people to remain in that status of homelessness.
Sure.
So I think everything that you do has to be measured. There has to be metrics to show what are you actually doing to move people up the ladder of either A, movement toward treatment for alcohol or drug addiction, for reintegration into community after, say, being released from prison would be an example. What are you doing for the person who is in their car because their cost of living is so high? They can't afford a place to live. Mm-hmm. They may not have a significant disability or any disability, but they're the working poor. And part of that would be to identify those people and immediately try to connect them with city services, whether that's housing assistance or even potentially faith-based or nonprofit organizations that have capacities to help people. When I worked with people and there's a terminology difference. You could say person experiencing homelessness versus a homeless person. Again, I don't mean any disrespect to people that are struggling, but as an officer, when I interacted with the people who were homeless, I had a folder that had just resources, lists of resources for anything. And I was able many times to connect that person right there with some of those resources, provided that they're willing to do that. Now, the other thing that would happen is I would frequently encounter someone that was debilitated by drug addiction. And usually the first thing I'd say to them is that I can take you to a drug treatment place right now. We can go and we can start your recovery. And their almost universal answer was, I will get it tomorrow. I'm good now. Again, in the grips of that addiction. So it has to be a very measured and a very metric-driven statistics that says what actually works to actually help people out of those situations. Because again, just throwing money at it and saying we're gonna build more food sources, we're gonna build more temporary housing, but if you're not addressing some of those underlying causes, you're going to be really challenged. Yeah. The other side of that says, at the same time, you're trying to have this compassionate, accountable-based resourcing to homeless people. We have statutes that are in place, say, in our downtown area for a reason. A lot of people will say, oh, you have those because you're criminalizing people that are homeless. No, we're not criminalizing people, but we are saying there are certain behaviors that are not allowed in a communal setting in a downtown city area. Okay, just like I can't.
Such as?
Oh, so as example, our sit-lie ordinance is one of the things that's kind of contentious,
Sure.
Which means that a person can't just sleep in a doorway. They can't lie down on a park bench and sleep there. But that takes away from the ability of a business to run efficiently. And I will say a lot of our downtown businesses operate on margins, meaning the profit margin to keep them open is very, very small. It is a very challenging thing, and I have huge amounts of respect for small business people. But all you need is one negative interaction with a person there, homeless person, maybe experiencing mental illness, alcoholism, something like that, that aggressively addresses one of your customers, and they never come back. Here in Colorado Springs, we all know that there are people that will just say, our wives, as an example, will say, "Oh, I'm not going downtown. I'm not going to take a chance on an interaction with a homeless person."
Sure.
Unfortunately, the vast majority of homeless people are struggling people that are kind and intelligent and good people, but there's a small section of those that are debilitated by drugs and their actions are not appropriate. Some are the con people that are looking for the easy mark to commit a crime. And with reasonable statutes downtown, like the sit-lie that says it's not appropriate for you to be acting in a certain way in this area. Mm-hmm. Listen, there's parks, there's things like that you can do that. But again, we're running into situations where, yes, and you can't defecate by the roadside. You can't defecate by the river edge, by the stream edge. That's a public health issue. Now, I do think that there may be other things we can do, like looking at a reasonable public bathroom that would greatly facilitate public sanitation and at the same time assist people in those situations. Mm-hmm. Because, if you've ever found yourself in a downtown setting and you need to find a bathroom and all of a sudden you realize that everything is you got to be a customer here or nobody's going to let you in the lobby here, imagine if you didn't have anywhere to go, what would you do?
Sure.
So it's a huge challenge.
It's just like when you need to throw something away and there's not a trash can available. And then what ends up, you see trash littered everywhere.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. That's a very good point. I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah. So it's a measured approach and a balanced approach with both sides. But at the end of the day, I am concerned that if we reduce the amount of city violations for things like sit-lie, for public urination as an example, then we run into a situation where that becomes a permissive behavior. Yep. And we start to see this downward spiral of people not going downtown, not patronizing businesses. And we have seen cities where that has happened, where things aren't lawfully kept in order. And the next thing you know, businesses are buying plywood to board up windows.
What about panhandling? Is that currently enforced or is that not enforced?
It can be. There's an aggressive panhandling statute. So the person standing with a sign, that's freedom of speech. Got it. No problem. But for them to go up and confront a person and say, "Hey, give me $1, give me some money," that begins to cross over into what we call the aggressive panhandler. Challengingly for me, I have seen that occur where I'll walk down the sidewalk and I'll look at someone that has a sign and you can see that they're going to approach you, and I look at them and they don't approach me, they'll approach the elderly lady behind me. So they're very selective in who they will panhandle to, being if they think that they can create an intimidating presence, if they believe that person has any kind of cash. And of course that creates an opportunity for a further criminal act there. The other part about it is that there is a real issue about people that want to panhandle, so to say, at the road's edge or in the medians. You will walk into the street to receive a $1 from a car, and that car stops, and that cycles the light again, and it begins to impede traffic. Or that person is walking into the roadway, and the driver is distracted, and you get a pedestrian car hit, or a traffic accident. So again, there's public safety issues all around that.
Is District 5, does it have a significant amount of homeless, or I'm unfamiliar with that?
Right. So if you're familiar with the geography of Colorado Springs, we go from I-25 over to Powers, east and west, and from basically Austin Bluffs down to Platte Avenue, north and south.
Okay.
So you have the North Nevada corridor, you have Platte Avenue corridor, and you have a lot of areas in between that a lot of people wouldn't consider to be areas where homeless people are, except they're in a lot of places that you wouldn't expect them to be. But yes, so we do deal with homelessness in District 5.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's good you're looking at that topic. I think, the last time I talked to someone that was on the homeless outreach team, and obviously Colorado Springs has a very good, in fact, the nation's first homeless outreach team. But when they do their point in time surveys, it's growing. And I think that's always been the challenge, right? Like, how do we plug the hole, but then how do we also get them back into society, be, fully functioning members of society? And, I'm curious to see how that goes. And one of the things you did mention about homelessness was maybe some of these people, they're having a hard time, and maybe some of that is because they can't find an affordable place to live.
There is an element to that.
Okay.
So part of that, a couple of things. Number one, I have found, as I have kind of walked with some people who were struggling, is it's a challenging bureaucracy many times to get through the paperwork to get either a public assistance or to even get that efficiency to get into, or a roommate situation. So part of that is to partner with that person to work through that system.
Sure.
The other thing that occurs for me is that as I look at that, we get a lot of people who, like I said, are that living in their car. Maybe they got evicted from somewhere, and now when they go try to apply somewhere else, they have this eviction on their record. So they may be as solid a person as you would want, but again, because they have that eviction on their record, they can't get in. Now, some of the ways that we can address that is, I don't want to take away the discretion of a landlord, but if you came along as either an organization or even a city and said, okay, this individual has a bad mark on their record, but we're willing to work with them to, say, cover their lease, or we will partner with them on their lease to keep them in the apartment to get them housed. Okay. And the other thing that we've seen is that the amount of city resources that we expend on a single homeless person, depending on how you measure it, could be upwards of $50,000 a year if they're outside. Once you get them into a livable situation with housing, that cost that they have on the community almost goes away, where they're able to gain a job, they're able to gain a profession, they're not ending up in the emergency room on a sub-zero night. They're not ending up in the emergency room because they were in a space where they weren't safe and they got assaulted. So again, there's a compounding effect as you begin to help people into those living arrangements.
Okay. I'm curious when it comes to growth and development in Colorado Springs. Yeah. Before I left the department, I went to a meeting. We had the mayor there. We had, I I think a few city council members. We had members of the CSPD command staff. We had city developers. We had the streets department from the city of Colorado Springs, yada, yada, yada. I mean, it was just a massive meeting. But the citizens were concerned with the growth.
Yeah.
And they said, we are expanding way too fast. And a lot of the resources that we have, they won't stretch that far. And so, one of the examples, and I don't have statistics on this, maybe you would know better than I would, but I know that they were expanding so far, I think it was northeast, that there was talks about putting up a police station out there. And the chief came out and said, well, you can build it. I've got no one to man that police station. Same with the the firefighters. Yeah. And so to what extent does city council have to do with the growth of the city?
Oh, a huge part. Yeah, they approve annexations. They approve zoning for building in what they call infills, building buildings inside spaces inside the city. Mm-hmm. Here's the real dynamic that you deal with. You can take an approach similar to Boulder that has really locked down new development. Median home price in Boulder is now $1.6 million.
Wow.
It is out of touch, completely out of reach of teachers, police officers, tradespeople, people that work a strong job, skilled people, but the pay that they make at $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year will not in any way enable them to live in the city. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you have that dynamic. But then we have the dynamic that says, okay, you have two options. You can annex land to build more residents, or you can build buildings in what we call infill areas. There needs to be a balanced approach. You can't give just a green light and say just go as hard as you want, because whether it was a chief that said that, he's absolutely right. You can build it, but there's not going to be any police officers to cover it.
Sure.
The other dynamic to annexing something, and this is something that I learned and a lot of people don't realize, what happens when you annex an area of land, particularly what are called flagpole annexations, that's a long, thin strip of land that connects to a large annexed area with the sole purpose of just making a path to that annexed area so that utilities can be connected to it. Mm. The utilities are bound by law that once a portion that's annexed becomes a part of the city, they're mandated by law to run power, gas, electric, and wastewater to that location. The expense of doing that is then passed on to that area and those future residents in the forms of property taxes, of different financial structures, where the people that may buy a house there in 3 to 5 years will be paying in a higher rate for something over the next 10 or 15 years. So they're paying for this expansion, and that's something that really has to be managed. So part of that is like, okay, that, depending on those numbers, might be enough to say that's not warranted. Mm-hmm. But there has to be a balance, because as you look at adding new residencies, and as what I would look at is low and mid-level housing, whether they be condos or something else, and there's a whole other subject around condos, people have to have a supply of livable houses or median income to low income houses to purchase in order to lower the price of the median house price overall. But it is absolutely a balance. There are a lot of people that say, not in my backyard. It's fine that you want to build a building, but I don't want to see it because I like my city the way it is. There's also people that say, hey, I got to Colorado Springs when I did, or I was born here, and I want to shut the door. Nobody else comes. Sure. I don't want to build any. Again, when you're in partnership with the community and you're saying to the community, we're trying to lower the median house price to enable a greater livability, it's a dynamic relationship that you have to have with the developers, where you say, no, here's my hard lines on, we have to have this before you're going to be able to build a project. Yes, we want livable space. We want green space. We want room for schools. We want room for livable area, bike paths, things like that. Mm-hmm. As opposed to just saying, oh, you've got this block of land, build anything you want in it.
Sure.
So again, there's multiple different people and stakeholders with any of these projects.
Absolutely.
To say they're just complex is a little bit of an understatement. It's beyond complex sometimes.
Yeah.
But a huge challenge.
Well, I think to the one of the big ones that has continued to be a thorn in the side, I think, of the city is the amphitheater.
Yeah.
It was interesting. So when I was crime prevention, we looked at all the blueprints for any building that's going to be built. The amphitheater came across my desk. I looked at it for crime prevention purposes. And they put it out there that they were going to build this amphitheater. And then the citizens nearby, I mean, they were pissed. And so they had this big meeting, again, going back to the meetings. Yeah. And it was so big that the deputy chief wanted me to go there plain clothes and take notes of every issue that the people had and report back to them, which I did.
Yeah.
And it really is interesting because I do feel, on the one hand, the developers, the people who are doing it in the amphitheater, they were trying to listen and make changes, and they wanted to get along well with the community. On the other hand, a lot of these community members, kind of like what you said, they bought it up north when it was a nice, quiet neighborhood, and now they have concerts and everything, and it's blowing them up.
Right.
And it's funny because I always like to think about the middle ground. Like, what's the middle ground in something like that? Yeah. But it's hard in that particular issue. Sure. It's either we have the concerts or we don't. And so I don't know. I mean, I think that's a tough issue in some senses.
Because that's not my district. I'm not fully studied on it. But I would say that my understanding is that organization is trying its best to do some sound mitigation.
Yeah.
And I could see the city council coming in having to vote on, say, noise ordinances or reasonable restrictions on loud noises at given hours. But the other thing I will point out, I worked the north end of town. Mm-hmm. And so I was there when that was being constructed as a police officer. And I was on the north end of town along Interquest Parkway as Shell's, the big athletic store, opened, as the restaurants populated, as the hotels populated. And I watched things become vibrant up there. Mm-hmm. And I saw that and I said, I could see people now wanting to live on this end of town. It wasn't just that you were out on the very north end with no services. And the other thing is that, like I would point out, the amphitheater, the restaurants, the hotels up there, they provide lots of jobs, huge numbers of decent paying jobs, and they provide a source of revenue for the city because people come there and they conduct commerce. They buy food, they buy equipment, all that stuff adds to the economics of that entire area. But it is a balance, and I do agree that there are people with legitimate grievances regarding the noise, and I think that still should be looked at.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I do know that the business has been trying, but I don't live there, so I don't know all of the complaints. I just know what I heard. But but anyway, well, that being said, I mean, I got to tell you, I wish you the best of luck when it comes to this city council. Yeah. You got my vote. Now, that being said,
you're here outside the area, so
I know. That being said, is there anything that you want to tell anyone that's listening to my podcast that lives in District 5 that might be listening?
Yeah, please vote for me. And here's the thing: it's an off-cycle vote. It's not in line with a mayoral vote. It's not in line with a federal, national, presidential vote. So a lot of people think it's not that important. I will tell you, probably more than anything, and I will tell you that however you wanted to vote in the presidential election here in Colorado, great, but you voted for the Democrats because all our electoral votes went Democrat. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to voting for people in larger populations, senators, congressmen, that kind of thing, much bigger population. But inversely, that your vote, as opposed to at voting in a presidential election, means so much more at the local level because there's much fewer people deciding on the people that you put in office. So I will absolutely, first off, be an advocate of study your issues, study your candidates, and vote locally. Local is where you will find the most impact on your life. We can't necessarily control what happens at the state legislature level, and we certainly don't have necessarily an individual voice at the federal level. Mm-hmm. But at your local and city levels, you have a lot of voice, and your vote counts. So I will say, I would ask for your vote. Please vote for me in District 5, Chris Burns at electchrisburns.com. You can look up my website. And with that, I say I am choosing to continue my service in a full-time capacity for this part-time job. And I have a lot of background in different areas in education that I think I can be very effective in that. So,
and what day can people vote?
Oh, You can vote now. You should have received your ballots already.
Okay.
Please fill out your ballots. If you got it in the mail, go through your mail pile, check the block for Christopher Burns, and please turn your ballots in by April 1. That is literally 2 weeks away.
Okay.
And if I knock on your door, feel free to ask me anything you want, because part of winning local elections is getting out and meeting the people that live in your area. So
Outstanding.
I have had a real education listening and talking to people in the area that I live.
Yeah, well, that sounds good. After you get city council, because
Okay.
I'm thinking that you're going to get it. Yeah, knock on wood. Any other aspirations after that? You going mayor? You want to president one day?
No.
No.
Here's the thing. I don't have a desire to run for Congress. I don't have a desire to be the police chief. I don't have a desire to run for sheriff. I want to run for city council and be a city council person. That's it.
Yeah.
If I do the job well, in 4 years, reelect me, but I'll be done at that point. No, I'm not going to go play politics. And I will say that's my outlook now, and I'm doubtful that it will change. I think I will have at that point I've done my share.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can respect that.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, especially those in District 5, please consider voting for Chris Burns for City Council. Chris, as always, it's a pleasure, my friend. I hope to have you on after you make it. Again, knock on wood. And
right, I'll come back for your awesome Irish coffee.
Yeah,
that's great.
absolutely.
Nice.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming, viewers and listeners. Thank you for stopping by again, and we will see you on the next one.
Great.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Mugshot Podcast. Like and subscribe where you can, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.